Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and I want to welcome everyone here to Franklin High School. My name is Jeffrey Roy. I'm the state representative for Franklin and Medway, and delighted to be here tonight with you for our second coalition meeting, our SAFE coalition on the opiate abuse problem that's going statewide. And we're working in conjunction with folks in Milford and Medway to bring a coalition and events like tonight to this particular area. Before we get started with Dr. Kelly's presentation, I wanted to just bring you up to date on what has been happening with our coalition, but also to invite you, any of you tech-savvy people who might be tweeting tonight. It's a good excuse to look at your phone when you want to do that, but if you are posting on Twitter tonight, we ask that you post your comments with the hashtag OpioidFranklin. That's OpioidFranklin, one word, and that will trigger the tweets to go out, and it'll actually go on a Storify summary of the evening's event. So take part in that. Our coalition has a board of incorporators that is meeting. It's a group of about 25 people who are getting together on a regular basis to create some structure for the organization, create some subcommittees for the organization. We're working on a website, a Facebook page, a Twitter page, working on some written materials to be distributed and some good resources to be used in the community. I'm also happy to report that $50,000 was placed into the state budget for FY16, specifically designated for use by this coalition to bring programs like this to Franklin, to produce materials and produce resources. So I also want to give a special thanks to Senator Karen Spilka, who through her leadership got that money into the budget and helped it to stay there. We already have 2 support groups that have grown out of the coalition work that we've done. There's a group that meets on Monday evenings at the Unitarian Universalist Church at 7 o'clock. That's Community of Hope. And it's a great resource for people who want to meet to discuss issues that are going on with their particular family. Along those lines, we have a second group that meets on Thursdays in Franklin at the YMCA. It's also at 7 o'clock, and that's called Healing Hearts. I have put information about those particular groups in the newsletters, and hope that you'll take advantage and participate in some of those programs. And on that note, if any of you have not received the newsletters and you want to be on the coalition mailing list, there is a sign-in sheet that's out at the resource table. Please sign your name onto that sheet so that you can get updates about what's happening with the coalition. There is a third group that's going to begin in September, and that'll be in Milford. That's the Miss and Matt Foundation. It's going to start a group on Wednesdays, and they'll meet at the Milford Regional Hospital. Our goal is to have meetings like this on a regular basis to help educate the community and work through this problem together. And how you can help is to continue coming to events like this, get educated, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, give us some ideas of programs and things that we can do to help you address the situation. Get to know the people who we bring to this community. The panelists that are coming and that are here tonight, who were here at the last program, are fantastic human beings. They're experts in their field. Get their cards, talk to them. They're tremendous resources for this program. Sign up for the newsletter, as I had indicated earlier, and please get the word out that together as a community, we can solve this crisis that's overtaking the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, tonight's program is going to begin with a presentation from Dr. Kelly. I'm going to ask Ben Waters, who has been doing his Eagle Scout project on helping this coalition get established and develop programs. He's worked so hard to get Dr. Kelly here. I'm going to ask him to come up here and introduce Dr. Kelly. After Dr. Kelly finishes his presentation, we'll bring up a panel, and the screen will go up. They'll be sitting in the seats. We'll have them introduce themselves, and then we're going to get some community engagement. So as you listen to the program, please, any thoughts, comments, or questions that you have, we have 2 microphones set up in the aisle, and we'll ask you just to line up at the microphone, and we'll hopefully have a sufficient amount of time to get to everybody who wishes to speak. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, who's going to introduce Dr. Kelly. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I just want to go through quickly some of the many qualifications that Dr. Kelly has and introduce him. Some of them you'll see up there already. He's an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and is the director of the Recovery Research Institute and is the program director of the Addiction Recovery Management Service at the Mass General Hospital. Dr. Kelly is the president of the Society of Addiction Psychology of the American Psychological Association and is a fellow of the APA. He has consulted for the White House Office of National Drug Policy, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the British Parliament. He is an associate editor for the scientific journals Addiction and the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment. His research work focuses on addiction treatment, the recovery process, reducing the stigma surrounding addiction, and his presentation will focus on the science behind addiction. And let me stress that those are only some few of them. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Kelly.
Great job. Thanks, Ben. Great, thank you, Ben. Very kind, welcoming, and introduction. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to be here with you all tonight. So I'm going to talk for no more than 45 minutes maximum, and that will give us plenty of time for questions and answers. So we're all here, of course, because of this problem that we are having, this epidemic problem we are having right now with opioids. That is in the context, of course, of a lot of other problems that we also have with other drugs, including licit and illicit drugs, that contribute to the burden of disease associated with addiction. So I'm going to talk about addiction broadly. I'll give you some of the basic concepts of addiction, as well as some of the specifics to do with opioid treatment and recovery. So these are some of the key points that I'll be addressing in the next 45 minutes. The burden of addiction is very big and it's growing. We know also that substances like alcohol and other drugs cause harm in different ways. We also know that addiction is a disease of the brain that hijacks the reward circuitry and radically impairs the ability to control impulses to use drugs, and I'll talk more about that. The good news is that even though it can take a while to get there, recovery is the most likely outcome for people who have addiction problems. There are a number of evidence-based treatments that can help people achieve and sustain remission and recovery over the long term. These include medications, behavioral treatment, as well as mutual help groups like AA and NA. There are also other recovery support services which are growing around the country. These are things like high schools, recovery high schools, collegiate recovery initiatives, and recovery community organizations. And also, despite about 14,000 treatment facilities, and increasing coverage, not enough coverage in terms of funding support for treatment, availability and affordability and stigma are the major barriers to accessing treatment for these conditions. When we look in the population, this is what we see. We have about 23 million people across the country who meet criteria, current criteria, in the past year for a substance use disorder. In blue is alcohol, and then in gray is illicit drugs only, and then the top bar there is both alcohol and illicit drugs. So here's one definition of addiction, which is, I think, pretty accurate. We think of addiction as a genetically influenced disease of the brain that's characterized by impairments in the neurocircuits of reward, motivation, memory, impulse control, and judgment. It's what we call a multifactorial or complex disease. It's not caused by one thing. It has to have a number of different things present to become manifest. And this diagram highlights these different components. So we have biology and genes. We know that genes are very important in terms of contributing to the risk. Roughly half the risk of onset of addiction is conferred by genetics. But this also must interact with the environment and also the presence of the substance. Without the presence of a substance, of course, addiction is not going to manifest, at least in terms of substance use disorder. Exposure to the brain, the drug on the brain, produces changes in the brain, both in terms of changing the brain in terms of neurotoxicity. So certain drugs will kill brain cells and change the brain, and also through a process of what we call neuroadaptation. This is the adaptations that the brain tries to go through to try and adapt to this abnormally high level of chemical influx produced by the introducing drugs into the body at high levels. And this combination of factors produces what we call addiction. So when you think about addiction, people say, well, why do people become addicted? And one of my colleagues said, well, that's really not the question, is how come we don't all become addicted to drugs that we're exposed to? If you think 90% of the population is exposed, for example, to alcohol. Alcohol is a drug. It's a psychoactive drug. Affects the brain. As you saw on the last slide, the majority of people who are addicted in this country are addicted to alcohol. So that's a legally available, accessible drug. It's fairly cheap to get. And that's where we see the highest prevalence of addiction. But how come not all of us are addicted to alcohol if we're exposed to it? And this relates to this genetic component to do with preferences. We all know that some of us like certain things, for example, certain foods. Other of us don't like those foods. Other of us will devour those foods more rapidly because we like them a lot. That preference, that predilection for different kinds of foods is related to our taste buds, and our taste buds are related to our genes and DNA. And so that influence, that preference for certain things, or the degree of reward that we experience when we eat certain things, produces different effects in different people. The same is true of drugs. So when you look at opioids, cannabis, cocaine, alcohol, whatever the drug you look at, it is going to be influenced by the degree of reward sensitivity that each person has, and that is a genetically modulated difference. The other thing to remember about substances is that they don't always cause harm through only addiction, okay? There are three main pathways through which substances cause harm. The one that we always talk about, why we're here tonight principally, is because of addiction. This is the compulsive use of a drug despite harmful consequences to the person. So even though they are incurring harm to themselves, it's very clear to themselves, they can't inhibit the impulse to use over and over and again, despite the harm. That's what we call addiction, this compulsive aspects of drug taking. That's on the right-hand side there. That's in the bubble on the right-hand side where it says dependence. Dependence is another term synonymous with addiction. But you can see there's two other bubbles there in the middle. One is intoxication and one is toxicity. So you can incur harm, of course, by becoming intoxicated without ever becoming addicted to a substance. We see it every day, right? People can actually overdose, for example, and die without being addicted. They can become intoxicated and fall down the stairs, crash their car. They may never have been addicted to that substance, but it can still kill them or harm them. The other bubble, which is related to the other two, which is toxicity. And toxicity has to do with, as the name suggests, a kind of a negative poisoning effect, if you will, in the human body. And this is, happens in the brain. There are neurotoxic effects on the brain that kills brain cells. It can also kill liver cells, for example, affect the liver through alcohol, and also cancer. We know that certain drugs, the most famous, of course, is tobacco, but also we're learning that alcohol is also a carcinogen. Many of you may not know that alcohol is a level 1 carcinogen. It's in the same category as asbestos, and it doesn't take much for alcohol, regular drinking of alcohol, to increase the risk of cancer, particularly oral cancer, esophageal cancer, and breast cancer in women. This is about 20 grams a day, so this is just over 1.5 drinks a day. Increases risk, for example, of breast cancer among women by 25% relative to women who do not drink. So there is addiction risks, there is intoxication risks, and there is toxicity risks related to substance use. These are the circuits highlighted here which are associated with addiction in particular. All drugs that are used to produce pleasurable effects do so via this mechanism in the brain called the mesolimbic dopamine reward pathway. This is a deep aspect of our brain hidden in the subcortical areas of our brain. This is the part of the brain that mediates all our experience of pleasure. Some people say that this developed as a way to make sure that we fed ourselves to stay alive, reproduce, and also to engage with other people. So when we are socially engaged with other people, this pathway is also activated. And it's activated through different neurochemical messengers. One of them you've probably heard of in the context of addiction is called dopamine. And dopamine is released into this part of the brain, highlighted in orange here, called the nucleus accumbens. And this is the area of the brain through which we experience pleasure. All kinds of pleasure, whether you're eating a chocolate chip cookie or a double-stuffed Oreo or a hit of cocaine or opioids. It's mediated through that, this part of the brain. One of the problems with addiction is that drugs, potent drugs like opioids, or any drug that can produce pleasure, tends to be taken too much because people tend to like that pleasurable effect and they want to repeat it. But the brain actually finds it very hard to cope with this abnormally high release of these neurochemicals. And so it goes through a process that is called neuroadaptation. We used to call this tolerance, but that was too simple. We had to come up with a more fancy name so we could keep our jobs. So now we've called it neuroadaptation, but it's essentially the same thing, is that the brain adjusts or tries to adjust and adapt to the presence of this abnormally high release of dopamine. There are many neurochemical messengers which are released as a function of exposure to drugs, including serotonin and norepinephrine and GABA and glutamate and endogenous opioids, and dopamine is one of them as well. Now, our bodies adapt to all kinds of things, right? All the time, our bodies are adapting depending on what is thrown at it. If you go and work out at the gym, and you go to the gym regularly and you're lifting weights, what happens? This. Right? I'm not even tensing there. I mean, that's what happens, right? Is you build muscle, right? Your body adapts to these heavy weights and it starts to build muscle. Pretty amazing, right? The body actually physically adjusts and adapts to the presence of these very heavy weights. Another example is, if you're ever out doing a job in the backyard or repetitively, and you might get, if you're digging a hole in the backyard or something like that, and you get a blister in the place where that piece of the pitchfork or whatever you're using is rubbing on your skin, you get a blister. If you keep on doing it, what happens? You get a callus there, right? you get a callus, you get a hard bit of skin that develops. That's very handy, right? Now it doesn't hurt. I can do that gangbusters, and I'm not getting those blisters anymore, and I've got that tough bit of skin on my hand or whatever. My body has adapted. The brain does the same thing. Now, if you think about that callus on your skin, right? I'm a guitarist, so my ends of my fingers are all, they got thick skin on them, right? I like that because it doesn't hurt when I play the guitar. But I used to get blisters, you know, when you first start playing, you get blisters. Now, the good thing is it doesn't hurt. The bad thing is they're less sensitive, right? I can touch a live match on my end of my fingers, can't feel it, okay? That can be a bad thing as well. It's a good thing in terms of adapting to play the guitar or dig those holes in the backyard without hurting me. But if I want to use that part of my body for more sensitive things, then I could do myself some damage. The same thing happens in the brain. The brain tries to adapt. It becomes desensitized to these high levels release of these neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine. And that desensitization that occurs, that habituation or adaptation that occurs, means that people become less sensitive to dopamine over time as the brain tries to adapt to this abnormally high release of dopamine produced by these abnormally high stimuli in the form of drugs. Like I said, our brain is kind of wired to receive normal levels of reinforcement. You know, social interaction, chocolate chip cookie, and at the top you have double stuffed Oreos. But you know, that normal level of reward we can kind of cope with. It kind of goes up and down. It's kind of within the normal range. But with too high a dose, the brain will try and adapt, and it becomes less sensitive. Now, as the person who becomes addicted continues to use the drug, the brain tries harder and harder to try and adapt to the presence of this release of dopamine. And all goes well for a while, because that can work for a while as the person is taking the drug. And as the brain adapts, what does the person do? When they experience less pleasure from the same dose, they just turn it up a little bit more. So now I need 2 hits, 2 pills instead of 1 pill, or I need 5 drinks instead of 3 drinks to get that same effect as I used to get at a smaller dose, right? This is called tolerance neuroadaptation. Again, all goes well for a while. Well, people are able to turn it up. Now it's 5 pills, now it's 10 pills, now it's whatever I need to get that hit, that same pleasure I got when I first started using. And what tends to happen, though, is that when people stop using and try to stop and try to get into recovery, is that there is that desensitization that has occurred in the brain. Right? So just like my fingers can't feel certain things, can't sense certain things that they're normally designed to do, the person who's addicted, when they're in early recovery, they can't sense normal levels of reward that they would get from normal things that they used to get before they started using. And this kind of dysphoria, this downregulation of this particular part of the brain means that people find it extremely hard to stop using, because they're in a constant state of dysphoria and downregulation that makes life extremely hard. And the only thing that they remember that will help them overcome that and feel some semblance of normality is to once again take the drug, because a big part of the brain that's involved in addiction is the memory component of the brain in the hippocampus. The other thing that's very important when we think about addiction is where it onsets. This is reckoned to be our top public health problem, okay? Top #1 public health problem in the United States, right? Alcohol and other drug use disorders related problems. And if we're serious about addressing this as a major public health problem, the idea would be, like other kinds of illnesses, to catch it early, treat it early, intervene early. And if we're looking at this in the population that this particular graph shows, this shows the age in the population along the bottom axis here, and then the proportion of people on the vertical axis. And as you go down, the darker colors represent more serious problems to do with alcohol and other drugs. But what you see is that the most serious problems peak at a pretty early age, right, between the ages of 18 and 20 in the population. That's where we see the peak onset of substance use disorders and other related problems. And so if we wanted to do something serious about offsetting potentially a chronic course of addiction, we'd want to intervene early and begin to disrupt the onset by screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment, beginning the conversation earlier. And this is why there has been a push now in Massachusetts as well as around the country looking at ways to do this, right? To screen and detect these problems earlier in younger people so that we can begin the conversation, destabilize emerging addiction patterns, and help offset both acute harm and also long-term trajectories. The other thing that's very important in addiction is that it tends to onset has its roots during adolescence. 90% of adults above the age of 18 with addiction have begun using before the age of 18 in adults, and 50% before the age of 15. And this shows the developmental trajectory of the brain from age 5 up to age 20 plus years. And what this graphic shows is a change in the cortical areas of the brain. The brain develops from the inside out and from back to front. So the last part of the brain to develop is the front part, prefrontal cortex, which is associated with our judgment, our ability to put on the brakes when we say no and mean no, to follow through with that action, to regulate those impulses. And that's the last part of the brain to develop. The brain is very changeable. We call it neuroplasticity. It means that it's malleable. It changes as a function of all kinds of learning experiences right up through old age, because we're always learning new things. And so our brain changes. But it's particularly susceptible to changes during this very early phase of development, in the teenage years. And this is why it's very important to delay onset of any substance use during the teenage years. Ideally until the 20s, just because the brain is a little bit more hardened then, it's a bit more hardwired, less susceptible to damage. We also know, for example, that exposure to alcohol during teen years is associated with a much higher risk of addiction to alcohol. So this graph shows this linear relationship. You can see on the left, if people started drinking before the age of 14, you can see the risk of about 14% will meet criteria for an alcohol use disorder later in life. If someone started between ages of 15 to 17, that drops to about 9%. If they started drinking between the ages of 18 and 20, about 5%. And then only about 1.8% if you waited till you're 21 or older. The risk is substantially lower of ever having a lifetime alcohol use disorder. Now these are correlational data. Don't prove that, but there's lots of evidence in support of this idea that early exposure is associated with a higher propensity risk for developing addiction. We've seen this in cohorts born after 1960 here in the United States. We've seen the degree of earlier drinking increase, and consequently we've seen tripling of rates of alcohol dependence among women in women born after 1960 and doubling among men. When we look at cannabis also, this is a hot topic right now, obviously, with decriminalization and legalization in different states. One of the issues is early exposure. Is it really just benign? Does it really do you no harm at all? Is it only good for you? This study was a long-term study over 25 years, and they followed teenagers before the age of 13, before they'd started using cannabis, followed them up to age 38, 25 years later. And they measured them on neurocognition, neurocognitive tests at age 13 and then throughout the follow-up. And they also looked at rates of cannabis use, alcohol use, other drug use over this same period. And what they found was that looked at, this one was particularly looking at cannabis, cannabis had no effect if you started using after the age of 18. It didn't have a negative effect on your neurocognitive functioning, but it did have a dramatic effect if you were using as a teenager. In fact, what they found over this 25-year period was that those who'd started using significantly as teenagers had a drop in IQ of 8 percentage points. That's the equivalent of going from the 50th percentile down to the 29th percentile. And this difference in IQ was maintained even when people had stopped for a year or more. Okay, so even if you were 35 years old and you hadn't used for a year or longer, but you had started using cannabis as a teenager, you still had this average decline in IQ. In fact, other people noticed it. When they asked family members and friends of people who were in this study of 1,300 people, it wasn't just a subtle effect, it was an obvious effect that was noticeable by family members in terms of memory and confusion and inability to focus. The good news is that early intervention seems to have an effect. So just like other kinds of health conditions that we might want to treat early and catch early, like cancer, the earlier you catch and treat addiction, the shorter the time to remission. And this shows that in cases that got treatment between 0 and 9 years after they started using any drug, got into remission about 7 to 8 years earlier than those who waited longer. I mentioned that most people who meet criteria for addiction actually achieve remission, right? Remission and recovery. Remember I mentioned that at the beginning. That's the good news. The bad news is that it can take a while to get there, on average. So we know from studies in adults that after the onset, once people meet criteria for addiction, for substance use disorder, at the moderate to severe level, it takes about 4 to 5 years before someone will seek specialty help, okay? 4 to 5 years after they meet criteria for the onset of addiction in adults. Now, why is that? Because people are afraid to disclose it, right? There's stigma associated with addiction. And people try their hardest to try and regulate, stop, control. Some people are able to do that. Other people can't. And the kind of people that can't, that tend to be more severe, they tend to be more complex, and these are the folks that we see coming into treatment settings. It takes them about 4 to 5 years to get to that treatment facility or treatment setting or mutual help group. After they start engaging with some kind of treatment intervention, it takes, on average, about 8 years to get 1 year of full abstinence, full sustained remission, okay? About 8 years, about 4 to 5 treatment episodes, on average, okay? So it means that half that sample is getting to that 1 year before, right? Before 4 to 8 years, half longer than that. So that's a pretty long course, and this is why we talk about it as a chronic illness. It's a chronic illness, but the good news is that most people will eventually recover. The other very important thing about addiction in terms of relapse risk is that after people achieve about 1 year of full sustained remission, about 1 year of full sustained remission, it takes 4 to 5 years on average after they've achieved that 1 year before the risk of relapse drops below 15% in the next year, okay? 4 to 5 years of continuous remission before the risk of relapse in the following year drops below 15%. Why 15%? Because 15% is the lifetime risk in the population. So to be no more likely than anybody else of meeting criteria in the following year for a substance use disorder takes 4 to 5 years of remission. So this is why it's very important. Yes, getting 1 year is fantastic and it can take people a while to get there, but people need long-term recovery, monitoring and recovery management and support over the long haul to help them stabilize and maintain that recovery over time. What kinds of things do we have that can help people? What do we know? What kind of evidence do we have about the factors, the things that can be brought to bear on to help people who want to enter into recovery? One of the things I've already mentioned is this notion of early detection. So very important, I think, is to try and detect these onset, these early signs, early symptoms much earlier so that we can hopefully prevent and destabilize emerging addiction patterns. And this is, seems to be, from the preliminary data that we have, seems to be true of addiction, that this is responsive to early detection and intervention. We have a lot of detoxification and withdrawal management paradigms and protocols which are very well established and medically safe when supervised by a medical practitioner. And we're very good at managing withdrawal. Really, that's where that's just the very first step, though, in addiction, right? We used to think that once you stabilize someone metabolically, you got them off their drug, whether that be opioids or alcohol, they're stable, their vital signs are in the normal range. Now they should be okay, right? Now we just need to kind of just help them kind of just stay there, but they're physically withdrawn from the drug. Therefore, the chances of success are high. Unfortunately, that's not true. Many people go through many detoxes, but find themselves quickly returning back to their substance. And there are, as I said, there's this downregulation in the brain, and there is also very strong responses to conditioned cues. And these are cues, people, places, and things in the environment, also different states inside the person, so mood, negative mood, that can trigger, once again, onset of use. So what do we need to do? Well, we provide other kinds of treatments, right? We provide psychological and social interventions that can support people's recovery over the long term. We provide medications. These can be FDA-approved medications like methadone, buprenorphine, Suboxone, commonly known as Suboxone, buprenorphine, naloxone, and also naltrexone in the form of oral naltrexone or injection, once-a-month injectable naltrexone called Vivitrol for opioids and alcohol dependence. That drug is FDA approved for both of those drugs because it works through a different mechanism, but the outcome is to reduce the incidence of relapse. Another important piece of treatment is the treatment of coexisting conditions. Roughly half of folks who come into treatment for a substance use disorder also meet for another psychiatric disorder, whether that be a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder or a psychotic disorder. Some kind of other psychiatric illness is going on in about half of folks coming in, and those things need to be attended to because those place people at risk for relapse to the substance, and ongoing substance places them at risk to the relapse to the psychiatric disorder and one can exacerbate the other. And so it's very important that we treat the whole person and not just focus on the substance use, that we focus on the psychiatric as well as other kinds of medical conditions as well. For example, infectious disease like hepatitis or HIV. Very important to treat all of this simultaneously as together as possible. As I mentioned, we're talking about a chronic illness which is susceptible to relapse over the long term, and so continuing care is very important. There are now some models emerging, clinical models of long-term recovery management. We're still working on some of those, what they might look like, how they might get paid for, and how they might be implemented in, for example, primary care settings and other kinds of medical settings that where people could go when they go for checkups for other health problems like cholesterol checkups. They might also get a checkup for their addiction and addiction recovery. So continuing care is critically important when we're talking about a chronic illness like addiction, just in the same way as we would promote chronic care for diabetes or hypertension. The other aspect is mutual help. Another aspect of things that help are mutual help organizations. So these are community-based peer support organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and other mutual help groups. There are now many different mutual help organizations, not just 12-step, but others too. The most empirical support, research support, supports AA and NA. That's where most of the research has been done. But there is more research now emerging on other mutual help organizations, as well as treatments designed, 12-step-based treatments designed to link people with these free community resources, and they've been shown to reduce relapse risk and increase the chances of sustained remission. This just shows you the economic burden. This is our #1 public health problem. And on the left-hand side, in the gray bars, that you can see the burden, economic burden attributable to alcohol and other drugs, about $450 billion a year. And you can see it in relation to other common diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and so on. In the yellow bar is the proportion of that burden which is spent on prevention and treatment. And as you can see, for alcohol and other drug use disorders, the proportion of funds that are actually appropriated for prevention and treatment is much lower than it is for other kinds of very high volume, high burden diseases. Part of that is stigma, of course, that contributes to that. It's always amazing to me how we're so quick to pay for the wreckage, to pay for clearing up of the wreckage of addiction, but we're very hesitant to pay for ways to prevent and treat it, to prevent the wreckage. But we'll write a check for $100 million for clearing up the wreckage, but we won't write a check for $2.5 million to implement screening and brief intervention, for example. So again, we need to take the big picture view here if we're serious, I think, about addressing these endemic and now epidemic problems with our opioid problem currently. This shows that in Massachusetts, these are Massachusetts data taken from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, which is an annual nationally representative survey that's done every year in the United States. But here's the Massachusetts data. This is very similar, actually, to the national data. In purple are the number of people who meet criteria for a substance use disorder but did not receive any kind of treatment. It's about 94%, okay, that met criteria but didn't get any kind of treatment. And about 7% actually got treatment. That is that's for alcohol use. A little bit higher, actually, for other drug use. About 13% of people with illicit drug use disorders actually got treatment. About 87% did not get any treatment. Part of the reason why people don't seek treatment, one of the major factors, is to do with this word I mentioned, this concept earlier of stigma. And we know from studies both here in the US and internationally that addiction is among, if not the, most stigmatized conditions in society. They did a study, the World Health Organization conducted a study of 18 of the most stigmatized conditions in 14 different countries around the world. And in this list of most stigmatized conditions included being a criminal, being HIV positive, as well as being a drug addict or an alcohol addict. And what they found was across these 18 conditions in 14 different countries, the #1 most stigmatized condition was illicit drug addiction. Number 4 in this list of 18 was alcohol addiction. So 2 of the top 4, including the top 1, was addiction related. So these are very heavily stigmatized conditions. I had the good fortune of being invited to the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy to their first ever National Drug Policy Reform Summit, which was held on 2013, December 9th, 2013. And this summit was held, this policy change summit was held to underscore a shift, a philosophical shift, away from the war on drugs towards a more public health approach. And I was invited to talk about how we frame and talk about addiction problems, how that can influence our approaches to it. And I've actually done some research which has surprised me in terms of the way, how powerful words and the associated concepts underlying those words can be in influencing even professionals' attitudes towards the addiction problem and people suffering from them. Now, why did we go for a shift away from the war on drugs? We have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. About 500,000 of those prisoners, of those 2.5 million, are there for drug-related reasons. And when you think about the cost of incarceration per year, it ranges from 14 to 60,000. On average, about $31,000 to put someone in prison and feed them for a year. That's just for the drug-related incarcerated folks. That's $16 billion a year that we spend putting people in prison for drug-related offenses. And we have a problem with overcrowding. It might be hard for you to see this, but this is actually the cafeteria in a prison in California, and this is where the overcrowding has gotten to. These are stacked 3 beds high. These are 3 beds high, people, triple deckers here of people sleeping and eating in the same place just because of the overcrowding. Now, if this solved the problem, that would be one thing, but unfortunately, the mass incarceration and mandatory minimum sentences has not actually had a significant dent in terms of reducing via the threat of harm. Of course, that was the idea that if you use, you lose, you're going to do time, but this doesn't deter. It's not sufficient a deterrent. When people are addicted, they're thinking of the next 5 minutes, not the next 5 years. We know that in heavily stigmatized conditions like addiction, there are 2 major factors which contribute to stigma. One is cause and one is controllability. We tend to be more compassionate and sympathetic towards individuals if we can say, well, it's not their fault. They didn't cause it. We also tend to be more sympathetic and compassionate to individuals if we can say they can't help it. They can't help themselves doing it. And of course, criticisms leveled against people with addiction as well. They did cause it because they went and used that substance, and they seem to be able to control it at certain times. Well, how come they can't control it? So they are to blame, and it is their fault and their fault. So I think that's a lot of where the stigma comes from. Even though we know now from a multitude of studies that addiction, like I said at the beginning, that the propensity for addiction, about half the risk for addiction, 50% of the effect is conferred by the genetic predisposition that somebody has. The other thing that happens, as I told you, with the neurotoxicity and the neuroadaptations that occur in the brain, is that these adaptations and these neurotoxic effects in the brain, they radically impair individuals' ability to prevent use. It doesn't mean that they can't. It's impaired, and it's severely impaired in some people who have severe addiction problems, so much so that they will use until they die. Okay? This is not a normal organism's behavior. Normal organisms are meant to carry on and not poison themselves to death. So there's something that's gone wrong in that person's brain, whereby that person is putting themselves at risk for disease and harm and death. Along with the war on drugs versus the public health approach is that there is a language that goes along with it. There's a rhetoric that goes along with it. And this is what I wanted to study and why I was invited to come and present these data to the White House at the Policy Reform Summit, is that we commonly use these terms. You'll see in the literature, even at our National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Drug Abuse and National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, use this term abuse, and this term abuse gives rise to describing people with addiction problems as drug abusers, right? I'm sure you've all heard of that term, describing people as alcohol abusers, drug abusers, and so on. The problem with that term is that it tends to give rise to the notion of somebody engaging in willful misconduct, that person really does have control, and they're abusing it out of their own free will, as opposed to a compulsive pattern of use despite harmful consequences. Now, if you compare that, now that language is consistent with the war on drugs, and that was used and has been used for a long time. Even though back in the 1970s, the World Health Organization actually said it's better not to use that term because it will give rise to this notion of abuser, and the abuser, like a child abuser, has a very negative connotation in our society. So if you contrast that with the term substance use disorder, someone having a substance use disorder, this is another term that is used, thankfully I'm happy to say increasingly used, to describe individuals suffering from these problems. Now this really implies more of a disorder, so that implies kind of a medical connotation, and this may give rise to the idea of a medical malfunction as opposed to willful misconduct. So what we did actually, we actually wanted to see whether exposing people to these different terms, of describing the same person using these different terms, influenced their judgments about whether that person needed treatment, whether they were to blame for their problems, or whether they should be punished. And this is a study, what we did, we took a paragraph describing someone in a drug court situation, and they were required to maintain abstinence according to the drug court that they were in, program that they were in. But this Mr. Williams had actually relapsed, and he'd been detected through urine toxicology screen. He had a positive urine screen for alcohol and other drugs, and so he was up before the judge. Now, in half of these vignettes, Mr. Williams was described as having a substance use disorder. In the other half, he was described as being a substance abuser. Otherwise, they were identical. And we randomly assigned them to an audience much like this, but they were doctoral level clinicians. Okay, so there were psychiatrists, psychologists, addiction specialists, and we asked them to read the paragraph and then answer some questions relating to, are they to blame for their problem? Should they be punished? Did they receive treatment? And the people who were exposed to the substance abuser term were significantly more likely to rate that person as more in need of punishment, less in need of treatment, more likely to blame for their problem, and should be held responsible. We also replicated that study in a general population sample. We found an even bigger difference across those same domains. So when people were exposed to the abuser term, describing someone as a substance abuser, it evoked implicitly this notion of willful misconduct. So what this implies to me is that even when we're not aware of it and we don't mean any harm by it, when we use terms like substance abuse and substance abuser, it may activate this implicit negative cognitive bias towards individuals with these problems. So now there is a strong push to change our terminology that's more consistent with a public health approach. This is a paper we just published in the American Journal of Medicine. We called it Stop Talking Dirty, because even among clinicians at Mass General Hospital, I've heard it said among my colleagues, we talk about clean and dirty urines. Now, we don't talk about clean and dirty or describe people as dirty or addicts or abusers in any other area of psychiatry or medicine, but we're still in the habit of using this kind of very negative terminology. So again, this goes much more beyond just political correctness or semantics, because now we are finding actually exposure to these terms induces these implicit cognitive biases. So it's time to change the conversation, the way that we talk about it. I think it's better that we use person-first language, so we describe an individual suffering from or with a substance use disorder as opposed to a drug abuser or substance abusers, and start to use language that's consistent with the medical condition that it is. So I have successfully come to the end of my time. I hope I've addressed all of these points. I think we're going to have about 45 minutes, I think, where we can have a Q&A. And at this point, I want to thank you once again for the invitation and opportunity to come and talk to you this evening, and I look forward to being on the panel for the next 45 minutes. Thank you.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.